Too much of small business relief funding, which was passed by the Congress, ended up in the hands of those who either didn't need it or criminal syndicates who outright stole the money. I made it clear, the watchdogs are back.
Reports of fraud since the start of the pandemic, approaching $700 million lost.
Fraudsters have gotten quite creative with their schemes during the pandemic. I think we've all been a little bit amazed. $700 million, it is unacceptable.
In some ways, Congress's response to the COVID-19 pandemic amounted to a striking bipartisan success. Amid crisis conditions, legislators passed 6 laws doling out in excess of $5 trillion in relief measures, helping to keep businesses open, households afloat, and the economy from outright collapse. Unfortunately, it also wasted money on a rather historic scale, and today we find out exactly how that happened. What numbers suggest? A study by the Labor Department's Inspector General looked at just one aspect of COVID relief: enhanced unemployment benefits. At the pandemic's U.S. onset in mid-March of 2020, initial unemployment insurance claims stood at about 282,000. That figure hiked up to more than 6 million in the first week of April. The CARES Act compounded the workload by expanding eligibility for benefits, extending compensation deadlines, and adding more weekly supplements. Such generosity was surely valid at the time, but the result happened to be a perfect storm. Overloaded state unemployment offices had no option but to rely on self-certifications of eligibility. The immense sums being dispersed also proved irresistible for criminal gangs, while the sheer volume of claims meant that even rudimentary fraud controls often went ignored. As time went on, the report found, one fraudster could have been issued several UI debit cards, with tens of thousands of dollars on every single card. All told, at least $163 billion out of $873 billion in total outlays was improperly spent, with a significant portion easily attributable to fraud. Other estimates have put the figure at nearly 2.5 times higher. Meanwhile, as of March, the government had recovered just $4 billion or so of the amount, with most of the misbegotten funds likely gone for good. But this isn't the only program subject to such waste. One study had analyzed 11.5 million loans dispersed under the Paycheck Protection Program. The results, about 1.4 million, or fully 12%, showed some indication of fraud. The authors suggest that total suspicious lending may have exceeded $117 billion. Where the money went? They bought Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Bentleys. And let's not forget Teslas. Lots and lots of Teslas. Many who participated in what prosecutors are calling the largest fraud in U.S. history, the stealing of hundreds of billions of dollars in taxpayer money intended to help those harmed by the pandemic, couldn't resist purchasing luxury cars, also mansions, private jet flights, and swanky vacations. And of course, those riches came by participating in what experts say is the theft of as much as $80 billion, or about 10% of the $800 billion handed out in a COVID relief plan. That's on top of the $90 billion to $400 billion believed to have been stolen from the $900 billion COVID unemployment relief program, at least half of which is taken by international fraudsters.
The enormous scope of this fraud. The vast majority of it, experts tell me, is probably unrecoverable. There were no checks on these PPP loans. It wasn't all stolen as in gone out of the country, but a lot of it went to the wrong hands, to people who didn't need it. So this is real money that could have paid for roads and bridges and subways and school lunches and student loans and all kinds of stuff.
The prevalence of COVID relief fraud has been known for a while, but the enormous scope and its disturbing implications are only now becoming more clear. Even if the highest estimates are inflated, the total fraud in all COVID relief funds amounts up to a mind-boggling sum of taxpayer money that could rival the $579 billion in federal funds that are part of President Joe Biden's massive 10-year infrastructure spending plan. The news comes from prosecutors, government watchdogs, and private experts who are trying to plug these leaks. Nothing like this has ever happened before, says Matthew Schneider, a former U.S. attorney from Michigan who is now with Honigman LLP. It is the biggest fraud in this generation. Severe lack of check and balance. Most of the losses are considered unrecoverable, but there still seems to be a chance to stanch the bleeding because federal officials say $600 billion is still awaiting to go out that door. The Biden administration imposed new verification rules last year that administration officials suggest appear to have made a difference in curbing fraud. But they need to acknowledge that programs in 2020 sacrificed security for speed, needlessly and exponentially. Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz, who oversees COVID relief funds, said that COVID relief programs were structured in ways that designed them to be ripe for plunder.
Yeah, we're using all of our tools to get the money back to the Treasury. Job is to let the public know how its money is being spent. Even minimal checks to make sure that the money was getting to the right people at the right time.
The Small Business Administration, in sending that money out, basically said to people, apply and sign and tell us that you're really entitled to the money, says Horowitz, the current chair of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. And, of course, for fraudsters, that's an invitation. What didn't happen was even minimal checks to make sure that the money was given to the right people at the right time. The criminal methodology. The criminal methodology varied depending on the particular program. The epic swindle of COVID unemployment relief was carried out by individual criminals or organized crime groups using stolen identities to claim jobless benefits from state workforce agencies disbursing the said federal funds. Each identity could be valued at about $30,000 in benefits. In contrast, the stealth of the Paycheck Protection Program worked differently, and it could have been far more lucrative. The program authorized banks and other financial institutions to make government-aided loans to businesses, loans that were to be forgiven if the companies allocated the money to business expenses. Nearly 10 million of such loans have already been forgiven. Many of these loans-turned-grants amount up to millions of dollars. Experts suggest millions of borrowers inflated their numbers of employees or created companies simply out of whole cloth. For much of 2020, lenders did very little to verify the applications, in part because Congress needed the Small Business Administration, or SBA, which ran the program itself, to issue explicit guidance that, in the interest of pouring the money out fast, lenders shall be held harmless for borrowers' failure to comply with program criteria. The Government Accountability Office did warn of fraud risk, but the program continued to flourish under the same rule. The government spent approximately $800 billion and provided 21 million loans to individuals, says Haywood Talcove, the CEO for government at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, which basically works with the government to verify identities. How much was stolen and how? To be fair, no one is sure exactly how much was stolen. A research paper released last year estimated at least $76 billion in potential fraud, and the authors said that number was conservative. The SBA's Inspector General himself identified $78.1 billion in potentially fraudulent economic injury disaster loans, which is another COVID relief program for businesses.
It is important for the American public to understand that they have a watchdog at the helm in your inspectors general. It is not as easy to quantify the number of efficiencies that we have promulgated across government.
Meanwhile, the Secret Service has its own estimate, $100 billion. The basic scheme was really simple. People logged on to state websites and took the names of existing businesses or registered new, phony ones. There's absolutely no security there, no validation of any information, and voila! You have a company named ABC with 40 employees and a payroll of $10 million. And you go and apply for a PPP loan and easily secure it. It really was a piece of cake. Ongoing investigation. To find even more cases, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee is said to be employing data scientists who utilize artificial intelligence to plow through 150 million records, searching merely for fraud patterns. In one case, it has found that a phone number for a gas station in Houston was used on 150 loan applications. It sends such leads to federal agents who then follow up on foot. One of the epicenters of the fraud is Miami, where Juan Gonzalez leads as the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of Florida. Gonzalez has said that, unlike with unemployment relief, which went to every single person who qualified, lenders had to stop making PPP loans when the money eventually ran out, even though demand continued to soar. The fraud didn't just harm the taxpayers, it hurt people who needed the money. The public, U.S. Attorney Gonzalez has said, should be very angry. He further went on to say that this was billions of taxpayer dollars that has been stripped from them, adding that more angry should be the people who did lose their jobs, who worked for businesses that couldn't apply for this money because it was gone. Those, he said, are really the ones who should be the angriest of all. The culprits. David Hines, 29, of Miami, for instance, admitted to a fraud scheme that made him $3.9 million according to his guilty plea. Hines, who said in court that he struggled with his addiction, was able to buy a $318,000 Lamborghini Huracan. He also spent lavishly on luxury hotels, jewelry, clothing, and dating sites. That is, until prosecutors seized the car and recovered much of the money. Further down in Miami, a man and a woman admitted to a complex scheme in which, among other things, they claimed to be operating farms with a huge number of employees, out of small homes in the middle of the city. Once you take a look at the paperwork, and once you saw what it was, all it took was a drive to the farm to see there was no farm, Gonzalez explained. In yet another Florida case, prosecutors charged a man who they say utilized money from a $7.2 million emergency loan to buy a 12,579 square foot mansion, a Lincoln Navigator car, a Maserati, and even a Mercedes-Benz. And it doesn't end there. Do you remember the California couple who were convicted in June of stealing $18 million, with which they went on to buy 3 houses, diamonds, gold coins, luxury watches, expensive furniture, and the list goes on? Just as they were about to be sentenced, they cut off their ankle bracelets and fled, even leaving their children behind. They were then captured in February in Montenegro. The man was finally sentenced to 17 years in prison, and his wife got 6. That leaves us with just one question. Is justice delayed still considered justice denied? You be the judge.